My name is Carol Markson, and I've been a senior financial analyst at Blue Ribbon Consultants for 6 years. 6 years of exemplary performance reviews, of projects delivered ahead of schedule, of building relationships across every department in our mid-sized firm. I'm not the loudest person in the room, never have been. I don't dominate meetings with expansive gestures or fill silence with unnecessary chatter. My mother used to say I was born observing, content to watch and listen before forming opinions. In high school, while other kids were campaigning for student council with flashy posters and lunch table speeches, I was tutoring classmates in calculus and helping the student treasurer balance the activity fund books. But I know my numbers. I know them cold. And I'd built that Q4 budget proposal from the ground up, identifying cost savings that would preserve jobs while positioning us for growth in an uncertain market. The proposal wasn't just spreadsheets and projections, it was 3 months of investigation. I'd interviewed department heads during their lunch breaks, reviewed 5 years of spending patterns, analyzed vendor contracts line by line to find redundancies. I'd even spent a Saturday afternoon in the archives room, dusty and windowless, pulling old budget reports to understand historical context. Blue Ribbon Consultants had been my professional home since I left graduate school with a master's in finance and more student debt than I wanted to calculate. The company specialized in operational efficiency consulting for manufacturing firms, and I'd worked my way up from junior analyst to leading our internal financial strategy projects. My first day, I'd been assigned a cubicle near the emergency exit with a flickering overhead light. 6 years later, I had a window seat on the 3rd floor and a reputation as the person who could untangle any financial mess. Warren Hutchins, my manager for the past 2 years, was the VP of Finance, a man who'd transferred in from our West Coast office with a reputation for being results-oriented and no-nonsense. What that actually meant, I discovered, was that he valued confidence over competence, presentation over substance. He had an MBA from a prestigious program and liked to mention it in meetings. He wore expensive suits that whispered rather than shouted their cost. And he had a habit of interrupting people mid-sentence if he thought they were taking too long to make a point. The next morning, I arrived at Warren's office at the requested time, 8:30 a.m., before most of the building had filled with the usual hum of activity. The executive floor always felt different from the rest of the building, thicker carpet, better lighting, actual artwork on the walls instead of motivational posters. Warren's assistant hadn't arrived yet, so his door stood open. He was standing by his window, hands in his pockets, looking out at the parking lot below where early arrivals were still finding spaces. "Carol, come in. Close the door." I did, my folder of presentation notes clutched against my chest like a shield. The folder was navy blue, professional, organized with color-coded tabs. I'd labeled each section precisely: executive summary, methodology, department-by-department analysis, risk assessment, implementation timeline. I'd even included a section on change management strategies because I knew the finance committee would ask about employee impact. He turned, offering me what I suppose he thought was a reassuring smile. The morning sun caught the silver at his temples, giving him that distinguished look that probably served him well in client meetings. "Look, I know you put work into this budget proposal. Good work, probably. But Thursday's presentation is crucial. The finance committee is bringing in external board members this quarter. Optics matter." "Optics," I repeated, keeping my voice level. My grandmother's advice echoed in my head: when you're angry, speak quietly. Make them lean in to hear you. Stephanie has a certain executive presence. She's done investor relations, she knows how to work a room. You're brilliant with the details, Carol, don't get me wrong. Absolutely brilliant. I've always said that about you. But this is about selling the vision, not just presenting numbers. It's about making people feel confident about the direction we're heading. I felt heat rising up my neck, but I swallowed it down. The budget proposal is built on 18 months of trend analysis and departmental interviews. I know every assumption, every variable, every single calculation. Stephanie wasn't involved in developing any of it. Warren waved a hand dismissively, and I noticed his college ring, another signal of pedigree. She'll get up to speed. You'll brief her, share your files. She's a quick study. Very sharp. She picked up our client portfolio in, 2 weeks? 3? When does she need the briefing? This afternoon would be good. Presentations tomorrow at 2. Less than 24 hours. I nodded slowly, not trusting myself to say what I actually thought. The words I wanted to use weren't appropriate for a VP's office, even if they were perfectly appropriate for the situation. Here's what you need to understand about me. I grew up as the middle child in a family where being overlooked was standard operating procedure. My older brother was the athlete, bringing home trophies from track meets and basketball tournaments. My younger sister was the charmer, the one who could walk into a room and immediately become its center. I was the quiet one who disappeared into books and found comfort in the predictability of mathematics. Numbers didn't play favorites. They didn't care about charisma or who told the better story at dinner. They simply were. 2 plus 2 equaled 4 whether you whispered it or shouted it, whether you said it with confidence or hesitation. That attraction to objective truth led me to finance. I loved the puzzle of it, finding inefficiencies, optimizing resource allocation, building models that predicted future scenarios with reasonable accuracy. In college, while my roommates were out at parties, I was often in the library working through case studies, finding a strange satisfaction in balancing complex equations. My friends thought I was boring. Maybe I was. But I graduated summa cum laude with job offers from 3 different firms. I wasn't naive. I knew that business required people skills, relationship management, all of that soft skill infrastructure that they tried to teach in mandatory communication workshops. But I'd always believed that exceptional work would speak for itself. That if you were the person who consistently delivered results, who caught errors before they became problems, who could see patterns in data that others missed, that person would be valued. Warren's decision felt like a repudiation of that belief. It felt like being told that all those hours, all that precision, all that expertise, it mattered less than the ability to smile confidently and speak in resonant tones. Stephanie Donovan had joined Blue Ribbon 8 months earlier, hired as a senior consultant with an impressive resume from a larger firm in Chicago. She was everything I wasn't, commanding in meetings, quick with a polished anecdote, comfortable with the kind of corporate performance that felt like theater to me. She had perfectly styled hair that never seemed affected by weather or stress. She wore statement jewelry that caught light during presentations. She had a LinkedIn profile with professional headshots and regular posts about leadership and innovation. We'd worked together on one project, a client retention analysis for a manufacturing company in Ohio. She'd delivered a compelling final presentation, complete with animated slides and a narrative structure that had the client nodding appreciatively. But I'd caught several errors in her underlying calculations. Errors that would have embarrassed us if I hadn't flagged them before the client review. She'd thanked me graciously, called me a lifesaver, and then somehow still received most of the credit when our division director mentioned the project's success in the quarterly meeting. But she photographed well in the company newsletter, and she'd apparently made a strong impression on Warren during her interview process. I'd heard him describe her once as exactly the kind of talent we need to compete at the next level. That afternoon, I sat in conference room C with Stephanie, my laptop open to the budget presentation file. The conference room smelled faintly of the cleaning solution the night crew used, mixed with old coffee from the pot someone had forgotten to empty. The table was fake wood veneer, scarred with the ghosts of 1,000 meetings. Through the window, I could see the parking lot and, beyond it, the strip mall where we sometimes grabbed lunch. She arrived 15 minutes late, coffee in hand, not the break room coffee but something from the expensive place downtown, topped with foam art. She was apologizing breezily about a call that had run long. So, Warren says you put together something for tomorrow. Want to walk me through it? I wanted to do many things. Walking her through 3 weeks of my work so she could take credit for it wasn't high on the list. But I took a breath, tasting the stale conference room air, and opened the first slide. The core premise is a strategic reallocation of our operational budget across 3 divisions. Instead of across-the-board cuts, which damage morale and often eliminate essential functions, I've identified specific areas where we're duplicating efforts or maintaining legacy systems that no longer provide value. Stephanie scrolled through the slides on her own laptop, nodding occasionally. Her nails were perfectly manicured, painted a subtle rose color. This is pretty detailed. Maybe too detailed for a finance committee presentation. They'll want the big picture, the narrative arc. The story, you know? The details support the narrative. Every recommended cut has a rationale that's defensible under scrutiny. The finance committee specifically requested comprehensive justification in their October meeting notes. Sure, but, she tapped her screen. This slide here, about the software licensing consolidation. It's like, a lot of text. People's eyes are going to glaze over. You need more visuals, maybe some icons or something. Those text blocks explain why we can reduce costs by 32% without impacting functionality. The analysis includes interviews with all 17 department heads about their actual usage patterns versus what we're paying for. Stephanie leaned back in her chair, studying me with an expression I couldn't quite read. You seem tense about this. I've spent 3 weeks on this proposal. 3 weeks and multiple weekends. 3 weeks of careful research and validation. 3 weeks that were apparently worth less than Stephanie's ability to gesture expressively. And I'm sure it's solid. Warren wouldn't have asked me to present it if he didn't think it was good. But he asked me to present it, so I need to make it work for my style. You understand. I understood perfectly. I understood that my work was about to be repackaged with a prettier bow, streamlined for palatability, stripped of the technical precision that made it defensible. And that whatever success it achieved would reflect on Stephanie's executive presence rather than my analytical rigor. We spent 2 hours going through the presentation. Stephanie asked questions that revealed she didn't fully grasp the methodology behind several key recommendations. She didn't understand the difference between fixed and variable cost structures. She couldn't explain why we'd chosen a phased implementation approach instead of immediate changes. She kept asking me to simplify explanations that were already as simple as they could be while remaining accurate. I explained, patiently, while she took notes in a leather-bound notebook that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in a month. By the end, she seemed confident, that particular kind of confidence that comes from not knowing enough to recognize the gaps in your understanding. This is great, Carol. Really great. I'll probably trim some of the technical sections, punch up the intro and conclusion. Make it sing a little, you know? Give it some energy. I knew. I knew exactly what that meant. It meant replacing substance with style, trading precision for pizzazz. Thursday morning arrived with gray skies and the promise of rain. I came in early, unable to sleep, and buried myself in routine work, expense reports, variance analyses, anything to keep my mind occupied. I'd been awake since 4 a.m., lying in bed and running through the presentation in my head, imagining all the questions Stephanie wouldn't be able to answer. My apartment had felt too quiet, too still. Even my cat had sensed something was wrong, following me from room to room with concerned yellow eyes. The Finance Committee presentation was scheduled for 2 p.m. in the executive boardroom on the 5th floor. I'd never actually presented there. My previous work had been reviewed in smaller conference rooms or submitted as written reports. The executive boardroom had floor-to-ceiling windows, a table that could seat 20, and a reputation for being where careers were made or broken. At 1:45, I saw Stephanie heading toward the elevator, looking polished in a navy suit I recognized from a recent department store catalog. Warren accompanied her, both of them laughing about something. She was carrying my presentation file in a slim leather portfolio. Neither looked in my direction. I was at my desk, staring at a spreadsheet without really seeing it, my coffee sitting untouched beside my keyboard. I told myself I had plenty of work to do. I told myself that this was just business, just politics, just one of those things you learn to accept in corporate life. That this was how things worked at a certain level. That maybe Warren was right and presentation skills mattered more than I wanted to believe. But at 2:30, my phone rang. Warren's extension. The caller ID seemed to pulse on my screen. Carol, I need you up here. Now. 5th floor executive boardroom. His tone carried an edge I hadn't heard before, not the dismissive confidence of Tuesday's conversation, but something sharper. Almost panicked. There was background noise, voices. I took the elevator up, my pulse quickening with each floor. The elevator was empty except for me. I caught my reflection in the polished metal doors, plain blouse, minimal makeup, hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. Not polished. Not executive presence. Just me. The executive boardroom door was closed, but I could hear raised voices inside even from the hallway. The assistant's desk outside was empty. I knocked once, and Warren yanked the door open so quickly I startled backward. Get in here. The room was tense. 5 members of the Finance Committee sat around the polished oak table, their expressions ranging from confused to irritated. Laptops were open, papers scattered across the glossy surface. Someone's coffee had left a ring on a printed report. Stephanie stood at the front, her laptop connected to the projection system, her earlier confidence visibly shaken. Her hands were trembling slightly. The presentation was frozen on slide 14, the software licensing consolidation section, the one she'd wanted to simplify. Warren closed the door behind me and spoke through gritted teeth. Can you please explain to the committee what we're actually proposing here? Because apparently the presentation isn't clear. I looked at Stephanie. Her face had gone pale, her carefully applied makeup suddenly looking like a mask. She wouldn't meet my eyes. Jeffrey Walsh, the CFO and committee chair, folded his hands on the table. He was in his late 50s, with steel gray hair and a reputation for asking the kind of questions that exposed weak thinking. Ms. Markson, is it? We've been reviewing this budget proposal for 30 minutes, and we're having difficulty understanding the basis for several of your recommendations. The savings projections seem aggressive, and when we ask about the underlying assumptions, we're not getting satisfactory answers. I moved to the front of the room, my mind shifting into a different gear. This was my territory, not performance, not politics, but the actual work. The thing I'd spent 6 years getting exceptionally good at. The software licensing consolidation recommendation is based on a comprehensive audit I conducted of our current technology stack over a 3-month period. We're currently paying for 17 different software subscriptions across the company, 8 of which have overlapping functionality. Some departments don't even know we have enterprise licenses for tools they're paying for separately. By consolidating to 4 integrated platforms, we reduce licensing costs by 32% while actually improving interdepartmental collaboration through shared systems. And you've verified that these platforms can handle our current workflows? This from Diane Hoffman, our head of operations, a woman known for her meticulous attention to process. I've done trial runs with each department head over 6 weeks. The transition plan includes comprehensive training schedules and a 3-month parallel operation period to ensure continuity. No one loses access to critical functions during the migration. The detailed breakdown is in the appendix, section 4, with specific timelines for each department. Jeffrey nodded slowly. That wasn't explained in the presentation. We were told the numbers were industry benchmarked, which is essentially meaningless without context. I glanced at Stephanie, who was staring at the floor, her hands gripping the back of a chair. May I? I gestured to the laptop. Jeffrey nodded. Please. Because right now, I'm inclined to reject this entire proposal as insufficiently documented. I took control of the presentation and began walking through the proposal methodically, not the sanitized, narrative arc version Stephanie had created, but the actual analysis. I explained the departmental interviews that had informed my recommendations, pulling up the appendix documents that showed my methodology. I showed the sensitivity analyses I'd run on every savings projection, demonstrating what would happen if our assumptions were off by 10%, 20%, even 30%. I walked them through the risk mitigation strategies embedded in the implementation timeline. The committee members began asking questions, real questions, technical questions, exactly the kind of scrutiny I'd prepared for. Jeffrey wanted to know about vendor lock-in risks. Diane asked about employee resistance and change management. The board representative, a woman named Catherine Brenner who'd been silent until now, questioned my assumptions about software adoption rates. I answered each one, referencing specific data points, acknowledging limitations where they existed, defending assumptions with evidence. When Jeffrey challenged my projected timeline, I pulled up historical data showing how long similar transitions had taken in comparable companies. When Catherine questioned whether our staff could learn new systems, I showed training completion rates from our last software implementation and explained how I'd factored those patterns into my schedule. 40 minutes later, Jeffrey leaned back in his chair, exchanging glances with the other committee members. This is substantially more robust than what we'd been hearing. Ms. Markson, why weren't you presenting this from the start? Before I could answer, Warren jumped in. Carol developed the proposal, but we thought, given the audience, that Stephanie's presentation skills would be more appropriate for the committee. Presentation skills are useless without substance, Jeffrey said flatly. And several of these recommendations directly impact my budget, so I need to understand them thoroughly, not hear them packaged as corporate theater. The silence that followed was exquisite. Jeffrey addressed Warren directly, and there was steel in his voice. I'm unclear on the decision-making process here. You assigned Ms. Markson to develop this proposal, then had someone else present it who apparently didn't understand the content well enough to answer basic questions. That's not how we operate, and frankly, it's not how I expect my VPs to operate. Warren's jaw worked for a moment. I made a judgment call about presentation style. Your judgment call wasted this committee's time and nearly resulted in us rejecting a proposal that actually has merit. We have board members here who've flown in specifically for this review. Do you understand the optics of that? Jeffrey turned to me. Ms. Markson, can you leave us the full analysis? I want to review the appendices before we make a final determination. Of course. I'll email the complete file within the hour, including the departmental impact assessments and implementation roadmap. There's also a cost-benefit analysis broken down by quarter if you'd like to see the cumulative effect over the fiscal year. Excellent. We'll reconvene Monday at 10 a.m. for a final discussion. I expect you to present, Ms. Markson. Not a surrogate. The emphasis on that last word landed like a hammer. Stephanie had already quietly gathered her things and slipped out a side door. Warren stood frozen, his expression somewhere between embarrassed and furious. The following Monday, I presented to the Finance Committee again, this time from the beginning, on my own terms. I wore the same plain blouse I always wore, pulled my hair back the same way, used no special presentation tricks. I just showed them the work. The real work, with all its complexity and nuance intact. They approved the budget proposal with minor modifications, and Jeffrey specifically noted in the meeting minutes that the thoroughness of the analysis had been exemplary and precisely what we should expect from our financial planning team. Catherine Brenner, the board representative, stopped me afterward to say it was one of the most well-researched proposals she'd reviewed in her 5 years on the board. Warren barely spoke to me for 3 days after that second presentation. He walked past my desk without acknowledgement, skipped our regular check-in meeting, and communicated through terse emails when absolutely necessary. The office noticed. Kyle from accounting asked if everything was okay. Our administrative assistant, Helen, who'd been with the company for 15 years, just gave me a knowing smile and squeezed my shoulder. When Warren finally called me into his office, it was late on a Thursday afternoon. The sun was setting, throwing long shadows across his carpet. He sat behind his desk, and there was something different in his posture, less of the casual authority he usually projected, more tension in his shoulders. The committee was impressed with your work, he said carefully. Thank you. Jeffrey suggested you should take the lead on the Q1 strategic planning presentation as well. Did he? Warren shifted in his chair, and I noticed he wasn't making eye contact. Look, Carol. I made a call that didn't work out. But you have to understand, in this business, it's not always about who has the best analysis. It's about who can sell the vision, who can make people believe. That's what gets projects approved, what gets budgets increased. I let that sit between us for a moment before responding. Outside his window, I could see the parking lot emptying out, people heading home to their real lives. The Finance Committee didn't need a sales pitch, Warren. They needed someone who understood the proposal well enough to defend it under scrutiny. That was always going to be me, whether you realized it or not. He didn't have a response to that. Over the following months, things shifted at Blue Ribbon Consultants. Not dramatically, this isn't a story about grand vindication or sudden promotion. But Jeffrey began pulling me into higher-level strategic discussions, asking for my input on capital allocation decisions and long-term planning. Other department heads started coming directly to me with questions about budget planning and resource allocation, bypassing Warren entirely. My cubicle became a stop on people's rounds, my opinion sought out. Warren's influence over my work diminished in inverse proportion to my visibility with senior leadership. He still attended meetings I was in, still technically approved my projects, but there was a tacit understanding that I had access and credibility he couldn't control. Stephanie left the company 4 months later for another position at a consulting firm in Boston. I heard through the office grapevine that she'd been frustrated with the technical focus of Blue Ribbon's culture, that she felt her talents were better suited to client-facing work where relationship management mattered more than analytical depth. I wished her well, genuinely. She was good at what she did, it just wasn't the same thing I did. We needed both kinds of people, probably, but they shouldn't be interchangeable. The real lesson, the one I carry with me now, isn't about office politics or proving people wrong. It's simpler and maybe more important. There's a difference between polish and competence, between presenting well and knowing your material so thoroughly that you can defend it from any angle, answer any question, acknowledge any limitation. Warren had assumed the finance committee wanted theater, wanted someone who could perform competence even without deep understanding. What they actually wanted was someone who'd done the work, who'd thought through the implications, who could stand behind the recommendations with evidence and logic. I still work at Blue Ribbon Consultants. I still prepare detailed analyses that some people probably find too technical, too dense with data. I still use more spreadsheets than slide animations. But I've stopped apologizing for that. The numbers tell stories if you know how to read them, and I've learned that the people who matter, the ones making actual decisions, the ones whose approval determines whether projects succeed or fail, want substance over style. Jeffrey retired last year, and at his farewell lunch, he pulled me aside. "You know what impressed me most about that budget presentation," he said. "It wasn't just that you knew your material. It was that you didn't try to hide what you didn't know. When Catherine asked about the adoption rate assumptions, you could have bluffed. Instead, you acknowledged the uncertainty and explained how you'd accounted for it. That's rare. That's valuable. I think about that conversation often. About the difference between competence and honesty, between performing expertise and actually having it. So here's my question for you. Have you ever had your work dismissed or reassigned because someone assumed you weren't polished enough? How did you handle it? Did you fight for your place at the table, or did you let someone else take the credit? And what happened when the questions got hard, when the surface-level understanding wasn't enough anymore? Drop your stories in the comments. I'd love to hear how you navigated those moments when your competence was questioned simply because you didn't perform it with enough flash, enough style, enough of whatever arbitrary standard someone decided mattered more than actual expertise. And if you're facing something similar right now, if someone's trying to take credit for your work or sideline you because you don't fit their image of what leadership looks like, remember this: when the questions get difficult, when the scrutiny gets real, when someone needs to stand behind the recommendations and defend them with evidence, substance always outlasts performance. Always. Because the truth about executive presence and polish is that they matter right up until the moment someone asks a question that requires a real answer. And in that moment, all the smooth delivery and confident gestures in the world won't help if you don't actually know what you're talking about. Know your material. Do the work. Be willing to defend it. The rest is just performance.